The Potter Hyam drummer, Tan-Tara, beneath creaking ice, the hollow-eyed drummer beats his own retreat, and winter follows. The 9th, East Norfolk Regiment of the Foot were also known as the Holy Boys. This was because the regiment's badge, the image of Britannia, was mistaken by the Spanish and Portuguese allies during the Peninsular War for the Virgin Mary. After serving with distinction in Spain, the regiment was sent to Canada in 1814 to prevent the United States' threatened invasion, America seeing herself as being in sympathy with France as her sister republic. Between the Spanish and Canadian campaigns of the Napoleonic Wars, there was a brief lull when the soldiers of the regiment were granted furlough, or leave. Many of them returned to their villages in Norfolk. One of them was a drummer from Potter Hyam. He'd been sold into the regiment by his pauper father when he was 10 years old. He was now 16. He came home to find that his father was dead, and his mother remarried. There was no home for him to return to, but 6 years in the army had taught him resourcefulness. With his soldier's wage, he bought an old canvas sail and made himself a tent on a piece of common land outside the village. Although it was midwinter, he kept himself very snug with a blazing fire. Every morning he would saunter into the village in his red military jacket with its shining buttons and buy bread and tobacco. The villagers recognized him. "Old Jess Dibble's boy's back, I see." "Yep, and squatting on the common like a gypsy." There was something about the lad that they thought shy of. It wasn't just that he was the son of a pauper. It was something more dangerous than that. He'd seen more in his 6 years away from home than they'd seen in their lifetimes. It was clear in his face that had been tanned brown by the Spanish sun, and bore on its cheek a long scar. It was in his eyes, too, that seemed to hold secrets they didn't want to inquire into. It was as though the war had left the boy both wounded and fearless. For the girls of the village, it was a different story. That combination of wounded fearlessness was a potent brew. They watched him cooking over his fire, self-composed and contented, whistling to himself. They watched him leaning over the bridge by the boat-yards, smoking his pipe and spitting into the river. They watched his red jacket among the smocks and grey fustian overcoats of the village boys. Every one of the girls was smitten, but it was Eliza Rust, the prettiest and boldest of them all, who went up to him first. "Are you one of the Holy Boys?" He smiled at her. "I am, Lizzie." She gasped. "How did you know my name?" "Because I remember you from before I marched away. A soldier never forgets a pretty face. Don't you remember me? Nathan Dibble, little Natty." She looked into his eyes. "So you are. I'd clean forgot you. You was sold into the army, and your father drank away the shilling the night you was took." "That'd be me." "Now what would you say to a ribbon for that hat of yours?" And so it was that Nathan Dibble walked Lizzie Rust to the village shop, pulled out his purse, and bought her a ribbon that matched his jacket. The next day he walked her along the towpath by the river. The next he borrowed a boat and rowed her out onto the Broad. It was there that her father saw them, talking and laughing and looking into each other's faces like a couple of sweethearts. As soon as she came home, he called her. "Eliza, you come here." He was standing by the fire, trembling with rage. "You leave that boy alone. He ain't no good. He ain't got a roof over his head. We all know what stock he come from. A redcoat on furlough only has one thing on his mind, and no daughter of mine will be a soldier's whore. You'll not see him again. Do you understand? Not never." But her father was too late. Poor Lizzie was completely smitten with Nathan Dibble, and Nathan had no intention of giving up on her. When one of Lizzie's friends came to his tent on the common and said, "Lizzie Rust's been warned off you, and her dad says you and she are through for good and all," Nathan seized her by the hand and whispered, "You tell Lizzie Rust this. If she loves me as I love her, then she's to wait to me at Swim Coots tomorrow night. If she don't come, then I'll up sticks and bid farewell to Potter Hyam, and she'll never see me no more." That night was bitterly cold. In the morning There was a skin of ice on Hickling Broad, that thickened with every hour that passed. By the time the sun set, it was strong enough to take a man's weight. Lizzie Rust lay in bed, waiting for her parents' breathing on the other side of the thin partition wall to grow steady and even. When she was sure they were asleep, she slipped downstairs. She had hidden warm clothes beneath the wooden settle. She dressed herself and pulled a thick coat over her wooden clothes. She pulled back the bolt and slipped out of the cottage. It was frosty, and there was a strong moon. The world was black and white and silver. The grass crunched beneath her feet. She made her way along the lanes that ran beside the icy marshes to swim Coots. She held herself against the bitter cold, looking out across the smooth, wide expanse of the frozen Broad. There was no sound, no sign of life. She waited and waited, and suddenly, from the middle of the Broad, there came a sound. It was the rattling and rolling of a military drum, the crisp tattoo of a military parade, and then she saw him. He was skating towards her across the frozen lake, in full uniform of the 9th Regiment of Foot, every button burnished in the moonlight, playing his drum as though 1,000 men were marching to its rhythm. As he approached her, he lifted his drumsticks to his forehead and crossed them. He stepped nimbly onto the frozen ground, unfastened his skates, and took her in his arms. His face was flushed, and his body was warm from the exertion. She unfolded herself against him. Their mouths met. He unbuttoned her coat and threw it down onto the white grass. And there, beneath the clear winter moon, they lay down together, and all of her father's worst fears were realized in an hour of unbridled happiness. When they parted, he whispered, "Tomorrow?" And she replied, "Tomorrow." Night after night they met at Swim Coots. Night after night he came skating across the board with the tan-ta-ra of his regimental drum. Night after night they pitted their warmth against the bitter February chill. But then one night she saw him coming towards her across the ice. He was beating his sticks against the skin of his drum, but there was no sound. He stepped onto the ground and took her in his arms. She found herself shuddering at his touch. "My love, you are so cold." Without saying a word, he unbuttoned her coat. She wiggled out of it and dropped it onto the ground. She seized his hand to draw him down, but her fingers closed around water. Her hand was wet with ice-cold water, and where he had been standing was nothing. Nobody. She was quite alone. Suddenly, she was filled with chill terror. "Nathan!" She ran out onto the ice, but it creaked and groaned and heaved under her weight, so that she was forced to return to the edge of the Broad. She ran along the edge of the Broad, but the thick cloud had covered the moon and she could see nothing. She made her way back to the village, not daring to say a word, knowing that if her father guessed the truth he would throw her out of house and home. She slipped through the door and climbed the stairs to the bed. When she woke, a cold rain was battering the window panes. She told her mother that she was feeling indisposed, and stayed beneath the bedclothes. She slept fitfully through the day, and as it grew dark outside she came downstairs to the kitchen fire. Her father was warming his feet at the hearth. He looked up at her. "Well, Lizzie, it's just as well you done as I told you. I didn't go breaking your heart over poor Jess Dibble's son." Lizzie paled. "Why's that?" "They've just fished him out of the Broad, drowned as a rat. He'd gone through the ice, they reckon. Though why he should have been dressed in the full uniform of the Holy Boys is a mystery no one can unravel. If he hadn't been strapped to that drum of his, they reckon, he'd have sunk to the bottom. What's the matter, Lizzie?" "She ain't well, poor child," said Lizzie's mother. "Now you get back upstairs to bed, my sweet, and I'll bring you a bowl of gruel. It is said that Nathan Dibble's ghost is still seen on Hickling Broad, but only in winter when the ice is beginning to melt. An old wherryman, recorded in 1906, put it this way: the folks had the notion that the Hicklin drummer lad go skating around swim cute, a beating o' his drum, to show the ice ain't safe.